You're watching the KUSI News at 6.
A sentencing hearing was held today for Navy Petty Officer Richard Sepolio.
Sepolio is being sentenced after his truck flew off a transition ramp to the Coronado Bridge, landing in Chicano Park back in October of 2016. 4 people were killed, 7 others seriously injured. Sepolio had faced up to 18 years in prison, but today the judge ruled that Sepolio will be sentenced for vehicular manslaughter and DUI, the maximum sentence significantly reduced by the judge.
The overall maximum term that this defendant could face is 9 years and 8 months, which hardly seems like a right amount of time when 4 people were killed and 7 others injured. But that's the nature of the DUI laws. There are problems and there are inconsistencies in the DUI laws in California.
The final sentencing hearing will be held next Thursday, and that's when Sepolio will find out exactly how much time he will spend behind bars.
And here to talk more about what happens next is Vikas Bajaj. Thank you, Vic, for being here. You know, I keep thinking about these college parents caught up in the scandal, facing 20 years in prison for getting their kid into college. This man has been convicted in the deaths of 4 people and injuring many others, and the most he faces is 9 years. That doesn't sound right.
Well, we're also talking about different points in the chronology. When we're walking into a federal case, we talk about total exposure. Here we're walking out of a state case where the jury has already rendered a verdict, which gives us a ceiling on what our maximum exposure is. But that point aside, I understand your point, and it's one that we all think about practically, but we have to understand in the world of driving under the influence, both in this state and other states around our fine country, it's a complicated set of laws that is put into effect at different times. So it's not always the case that the laws jive with each other until a judge, like Judge Rogers, calls a hearing a special hearing. We don't have these hearings all the time, and I can tell you from my experience handling these cases, these legal arguments are usually hashed out in court during the final sentencing hearing. My gut feeling tells me that Judge Rogers was doing the right thing, the compassionate thing, and said, I don't want to do this in front of the families, to go through this legal argument for hours. Let's hash that out first, and then we'll hear the victim statements afterwards. But there really is no surprise in the reduced penalties here. Many times jurors come back with verdicts, let's say for an odd or an even number 10. Well, 8 of those 10 can describe the same conduct. So it's the judge's role to say, well, we're not going to punish the same conduct 2 or 3 times. That's part of what happened today. Another part, importantly, was Judge Rogers looking at the facts of the case, the reconstructions that were done to prove causation, and come to a finding that Mr. Sepolio maybe wasn't the only cause. Therefore, he could not meet the element of being the personal cause or the person who personally inflicted the great bodily injury. Now, the forceful impact of this finding is extraordinary. That single-handedly takes a punishment in a case like this from 15 years down to around 8 to 9 years, which is what we have here. The reason for that is the state law penalizes those who intentionally cause harm to others. That elevates the crime to require 85% of your time to be served in state prison. Judge Rogers seems to have had a very difficult time given the structure of the bridge, the lack of the barrier, and other things that could have also been intervening causes of the deaths.
You have gross vehicular manslaughter, DUI,
yes.
Driving while intoxicated, a lot of different legal theories and different levels of culpability. Is that what he's looking at to determine why maybe this is now only about 9 years versus maybe some other type of set of circumstances that could get more punishment?
Yes and no. The jury has already made that decision that this is not an appropriate factual scenario for gross negligence. They did not return a conviction there. They returned the conviction on ordinary negligence. And the difference is not the commission of the DUI, not the speeding or perhaps cutting someone off on the highway. The difference is the manner manner in which that other infraction is committed. Was it so outside the realm of what we would expect as a reasonable person and not act that type of reckless action? Now, in this case, the jury already found that. So the question is, what is the punishment here in a case that allows for probation? The law here is not a mandatory 9 years and 8 months. It's a maximum now of 9 years and 8 months, and all the way down to probation and everything that could be included therein.
So when the judge looks, he's going to be looking out at these families who've lost their loved one and have loved ones injured, and he's also going to be looking at Mr. Sepolio, who we understand is going to become in his uniform, his Navy uniform tomorrow.
And that's correct. And I think that's a balancing act. And having been before Judge Rogers and holding his courtroom in probably the highest esteem I can hold any judicial officer in our fine state, I will tell you, you couldn't have this case in a more perfect courtroom, one that is very experienced in balancing the needs of the victims and the families who have lost loved ones, and also an individual who was law-abiding and graciously served us, our country, through the Department of the Navy. So how do you balance those? And that's the real conflict. There are no winners when we're talking about DUI fatalities.
Certainly not.
Vic Bajaj, thanks so much for coming in.
My
We'll,
pleasure.
of course, follow it on Thursday. We'll hear from the victims' families. We'll hear from Mr. Sepolio himself, and we'll get a decision from the judge.
Yes,
Appreciate
tough decision.
it. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks so much.